back a year ago.
Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of the Beer Bound podcast. Today we are joined by Professor Glenn Carroll. Glenn grew up in Indiana. He obtained his bachelor's degree at Indiana University and his master's and doctorate degrees at Stanford University. Glenn currently serves as Professor of Management and Professor of Sociology by courtesy in the School of Humanities and Sciences at his alma mater of Stanford. Glenn's research addresses questions about organizations, strategic management, and industrial evolution. His most recent project studies socially constructed authenticity, how consumers and others value authenticity, how consumers search for authenticity in products and services, and how consumers interpret organizational behavior and structure as reflecting authenticity. We stumbled upon an article Glenn wrote back in the year 2000 in the American Journal of Sociology entitled, "Why the Microbrewery Movement? Organizational Dynamics of Resource Partitioning in the U.S. Brewery Industry." We're excited to speak to Glenn and learn more about his particular focus in the field of management. So Glenn, welcome to the Beer Bound podcast. How are you, sir?
Good. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome.
The pleasure is ours. So Glenn, can you take us back a little bit, maybe into your focus, your particular stream of expertise in the academic world? Because I think it kind of branches off in a few different directions. So can you delve a bit deeper for us?
Sure. So I have a PhD in sociology, as you mentioned, and I study organizations, and organizational theory is my expertise. I've taught that all my career. Like a lot of organizational sociologists, I teach in a business school and have taught in a business school my whole career. So, I kind of straddle two worlds. On the one hand, management and business. On the other hand, sociology. It's very useful to be in a business school because if you call up a corporation and want to ask them some questions, or come visit or talk to them, understand what's going on, if you introduce yourself as a business school professor, you get a much better reception than if you introduce yourself as a sociologist, unfortunately. So they're not nearly as suspicious, and they're usually more likely to be cooperative.
How come that sort of happened? Why did your interest in sociology, how did that bring you into the business world? Because I don't think that always necessarily has to happen. You can focus more in different forms of sociology.
Sure. So, but actually, I said that my whole career is spent in business schools. That's almost true. My first job was in the sociology department at Brown University. But in business, the top business schools, including Rotman in Toronto, are populated by faculty who, for the most part, come from the social science disciplines. So they have PhDs in economics, psychology, sociology, mathematics, operations, engineering, you name it. Sometimes they have PhDs in business, but not all that often. So I'm not that unusual. I mean, if you value high quality social science research, the disciplines are usually better sources of talent than the business schools. Although that is changing, and it has changed in the last decade or so. But that's been true for most of my career. So, I'd say most of the organizational sociologists, that I know do work in business schools, just like most of the psychologists who study organizational behavior in business schools as well. They're just better contexts. As I mentioned before, you're more receptive to business. The pay is a little better, and the research support's a little better. You do have to teach a different set of students. You teach students who want to be managers rather than who want to be sociologists or psychologists. So that makes it a little bit different. That's something you have to learn early in your career to do. But, most of us have done that.
Do you have a preference teaching to business students or sociology students?
I've taught so few sociology students in my life that I don't even know what it's like, really, because I just teach business school students. I teach, I've taught undergraduates who are business majors at Berkeley, MBA students at Berkeley, Columbia, and Stanford, and executives at Stanford and other places. So the variation in our teaching tends to be above the audience rather than a material itself. So we teach a lot of the same kinds of things, but you have to talk very differently to undergraduates than you do to senior executives. And the kind of discussion you can have is very different.
Yeah, I can imagine. Glenn, can you tell us about your focus in your doctoral studies? What did you actually zone into for, say, your thesis, and the time you spent mastering your craft?
Yeah, so this kind of leads into how I got into studying the beer brewing industry, in fact. So I was an organizational, as I said, my organizations is my area, organizational theory. And at the time when I was doing my dissertation, I was involved with faculty here who were looking at new ways of studying organizations. And those new ways involved thinking about organizational change as a process of environmental selection rather than the adaptation of individual organizations. So when people think of organizational change, they often think of a focal organization and then the kind of challenges that it faces in its market and its technology. And then they think about how does it adapt over time. That's one model, but in fact, lots of organizations don't adapt or can't adapt successfully and they fail. So another model of how, let's say, the beer brewing industry is different today than it was 30 years ago is not a story about individual organizations adapting, but is about how organizations fail because they have an old model and new organizations with a different model crop up and take over the landscape. So, I was interested in that particular set of problems, and my dissertation was a study of the newspaper industry in the United States. Newspapers in the United States tend to be, historically have been a very local industry where the papers did not transcend the metropolitan area. So I studied, I think it was 7 different metropolitan areas in the United States from their beginning up until we collect historical data on all the newspapers that ever operated for 150 to 200 years in these cities, and studied what happened. Now, the connection to beer is this. So when I was studying newspapers, this would have been the early 1980s. The big story then was about how daily newspapers were dying left and right. And so you had what was often termed the evolution of one newspaper cities in America. So cities like New York or St. Louis, let's say, or Philadelphia or Miami, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, they might have had a dozen daily newspapers competing. You get to 1975, 1980, there often was one left. And so the story about how it developed had to do with the economics of scale, and in particular, the economics of scale related to production, but also to advertising. So if you think about, just to give you an example there, if you think about how much it costs to produce the first issue of a daily newspaper, it's a fortune, right? Because you have all the reporters, all the editing, all the typesetting, it used to be all the printing and the typecasting and typesetting and the printing and all that. But if you think about what it costs to produce the second daily newspaper, the second copy of that, it's whatever the first one cost plus a couple of pennies, right? Because you're just running off a copy. So papers that have big circulation bases can amortize the cost of production over all those subscriptions, and they can produce a much better and more broadly appealing newspaper than papers with a small circulation base that don't have that funds. And so this is the story economists use, and I totally believe it, about how daily newspapers in the United States in metropolitan areas developed. For some often random reason, one newspaper in this competition got a big size advantage. They were often family businesses. So it might have been a family member died, or there was a fight, or it could have been a labor union struggle, or it could have been anything, a fire in a building. One newspaper gets a big size advantage, and no matter what its content was, left, right, lowbrow, highbrow, they could use that size advantage then to produce a more appealing paper to almost everyone. And over time, they outcompeted everybody, and you wind up with one newspaper cities. So when I collected the data for my dissertation, started looking at it, I saw that trend very clearly. There was no question about that. But I also saw another trend, which was not talked about very much, and which was kind of surprising, which was at the same time that this was going on, this consolidation was going on, there was a proliferation of small specialized newspapers going on in these same markets. So what happened was you had these competing papers in the middle that took up all the market. As they consolidated, you got one paper left. It was bigger than any of the previous ones, but it still didn't reach as many consumers as all of the dailies did combined before. And so that created these little pockets for papers to pop up that appealed to, highly specific groups, might be professional groups, might be ethnic groups, might be communities in a particular area like this. And if you weren't in one of those groups, you probably didn't even know that paper existed. But if you were in one of those groups, you knew it, you found it very useful, and it was very appealing. It's a long-winded story, sorry, but it is related to where we're going to go with beer.
I think I know where you're going. Yeah,
So I developed a model about positioning in the market and about how at the same time you got this concentration, you could also get this proliferation of small specialist organizations at the same time. That model was kind of heretical to economists at the time because prevailing economic theories suggested that when you have big dominant organizations, it created barriers to entry in a market and nobody else could get in. Now, nobody was getting in that was really going to compete with the Washington Post or with the Chicago Tribune. That's clear. But all these other little things that economists often didn't pay attention to, they did get in and they proliferated, became a big deal. So the connection to beer is this. So when I was publishing the paper about that story, which is what's called resource partitioning, that's where the title comes from, in the American Journal of Sociology in 1985, I think. When I was publishing it, academic papers are peer reviewed. So you go through a process of some months where other people read it, and then you get anonymous reviews where they tell you everything wrong with it. You have to revise the paper, and the editor supervises this, and then eventually, if it is good enough, it'll be approved and published. Well, in the process of this review, one of the reviewers said, well, this is great, and I believe it's a really interesting story, but, newspapers are just one industry, and it would be interesting to know what are the other industries where this might happen and what are the conditions that produce that. And so I thought about it, and I, came up with a set of conditions that I thought made the difference in newspapers. And then I looked around at some other industries and said, what are other industries that kind of match these conditions that might be ripe for a similar process. And I was young then, so I was brash, so I was willing to be adventurous. I was willing to say things, especially in print, that I probably wouldn't do now. I just don't have the guts to do it now, because you can be wrong. You usually are wrong when you get around predictions. But in that article, in the end, I said the beer brewing industry looks very ripe. It looks like it matches the same conditions. It looks ripe for this, and maybe there will be a rise of specialist breweries in the future coming on. And so I basically predicted the microbrewery movement in 1984, 1985, and there were maybe 6 or 7 microbreweries in the U.S. and Canada at the time. So it was a bold prediction, which wound up to be right. I'm 1 for 1, and I quit.
Paid off, yeah.
I quit. I quit. But when I tell that story to my MBA students, they always say, "Wow, that's really good. So you must have made a lot of money by investing in the beer brewing industry." And I said, well, I guess I didn't really have faith in my prediction, because no, I didn't. But that got me, making that statement got me interested in the beer brewing industry. And I was working at Berkeley at the time, and Berkeley was the home of a couple of these early microbreweries and brew pubs. And I started thinking about it more, and then as it kept growing, I got more interested in it, and I wound up getting involved with a lot of these people and going and interviewing them and looking at their place and talking to them. People like Fritz Maytag from Anchor Brewing, and Pete Schlossberg and Pete's Wicked Ale, and a bunch of people like that who were really the pioneers of the microbrewing movement were all based here, and were people that I could talk to, and were very, very interesting and fun to talk to.
Yeah, no kidding. So if I were you, I would brag about that story all the time, being the one that predicted this big industry.
when I did publish the paper you mentioned at the beginning, it does note in there that there was this prediction made by this guy named Carroll.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you have to give yourself credit for that. Absolutely. I think that those parallels make complete sense to me. So if I understand this correctly, you have a multitude, say 50 years ago, you had quite let's say a dozen as an example, large newspapers, or let's use your newspaper example. And then by the time you were writing in the 80s, all of those kind of were gobbled up and you had a monopoly on top. But with that, you also had the sprinkling of this little sort of subculture of lots of little independent newspapers being able to flourish in their own little subcultural areas. That's kind of, is that a basic summary?
That's right on.
And you're right. And craft beer is literally the same thing. You see Anheuser-Busch just ate everybody. And then you had, it's so funny because you mentioned I think in 2000 in your article, you mentioned, I think there were 1,400 craft breweries in the United States. And you were kind of boasting about how this is great because we surpassed Germany. And that's a big thing because Germany's, of course, one of the big beer titans of the world. But then you jump ahead 22 years later, and now I think we're over I think you're over 8,000 breweries.
Yeah, that's just amazing. That's just amazing. I mean, look, I didn't predict that. I would, if you'd asked me in 2000, I would have never imagined that the microbrewing industry could reach the heights it has today. I mean, it's just it's not just the numbers, the continued innovation, all of the different kinds of products, and borrowing from Belgian recipes and from, and inventing their own. This is an amazing story of innovation and economic growth. However, I mean, it is a little, I think you can exaggerate that too much because at least as my understanding is total beer consumption hasn't really gone up that much, and maybe it's flattened out a little bit. So the growth of the microbreweries has come at the cost of both imported beers and some of the major domestic players. So it's changed the industry, but it hasn't so much grown it, which is fine. But it's now a much bigger segment than it was.
Well, on top of that, did you analyze at all the consumption of the actual typical newspaper reader? Like, did that go up? Did it go down? Did it stay consistent when a lot of the larger newspapers consolidated or went out of business? Did the typical American still consume a newspaper at the same rate, or perhaps not?
No, I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. And then the internet came along and that changed everything for newspapers. And then we got the rise of national. Most newspaper industries in the world, most countries have a national newspaper industry. And so that really didn't happen in the United States until 1975 or 80. And then, the Christian Science Monitor was maybe the first national newspaper, and then the New York Times and the Washington Post. And now you have a half a dozen of them that have national circulation. So it's very, very different. To answer your question directly, my sense would be, if and I don't recall if we had this data or could find it even, if you looked at readership data at that period, my guess would be the people who were reading these small specialist papers were also reading the dominant daily in their town. So they would get the Toronto Star, but also read, a couple of these specialty newspapers. It's not like they were substitutes the same way microbrewed beer is for Budweiser. I don't think your average microbrewer drinker is drinking Budweiser. I could be wrong, but they will if they have no choice. They're stuck in the World Cup VIP suite. There's nothing else available. Yeah, okay. But other than that, no. Yeah.
That's interesting. Maybe I'm just curious when going over that your point with the newspapers, and that's entirely not our field at all. But is that still relevant today? Like some of those local papers, like Andy was saying, sprinkled in and around the big guys. Is that still as, let's say, as prevalent as maybe craft beer is today, or do you have any insight on that?
I know, and I don't really know. I haven't followed that. I could guess. My guess would be, they probably have not grown like microbreweries have. I'm pretty sure that's good. I mean, again, I think part of that is because of the internet. I mean, with all the kind of information sources available and blogs and stuff out there, that people get information from the internet much more than they used to. And even the big newspapers struggle with, what to do with their physical product these days.
I think it's probably blown up even more. I mean, everyone has a blog.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own little paper.
Obviously, with the World Wide Web, that has an effect on how you gather information, whether it is from the news or not. But with craft beer, maybe I guess to a point you were saying, Glenn, tweaking of styles and the innovation on recipes and things like that. Maybe that's been, how craft beer has sustained such a movement. But just the thought, something maybe we can go down a rabbit hole later on, Andy. But interesting thoughts on it, yeah.
Can you tell us, Garrett and I, your relationship with beer? Are you a bit of a beer fan, or is just an academic treat for you to delve into the culture of microbreweries?
So when I was younger, I used to drink a lot of beer. I mean, I think probably I first drank beer when I was 16 years old, something like that. And then, when I was a young man until maybe 30, 35, I primarily drank beer. I drank a lot of beer. Now, just the volumes as you get older is not so easy to process all that liquid. So I tend to drink wine these days. My budget for alcohol has also gone up. So, I wish I was only buying beer. It'd be a lot cheaper. But, I buy wines and I really like fine wine. But, beer, I grew up in Indiana, as you mentioned, and, that's what we drank there was beer. I was from a German, my mother's family was German. There are a lot of German festivals every summer. And that's what we drank is beer.
Yeah. So, you live in the Bay Area now, correct?
Yeah.
So,
yes.
So lots, you could probably spend a pretty penny at some nice craft breweries, but I understand as one maybe gets a bit older, they're maybe interested in a bit of wine culture as well. Now, Glenn, you also, a lot of your focus, as well as I touched very briefly in the introduction, is on industries and the concept of authenticity. And I read some of your articles, and your abilities in academic verbose and writing as far exceeds my reading ability in many respects. So can you talk to Garrett and I a little bit about this focus of authenticity in the business world, in management, and why that's so important for industries to come off as authentic?
Sure. So in fact, this interest also started with my studies in the beer brewing industry. So when I went back and studied the microbreweries seriously and collected data and estimated models on it, we saw a similar process to what we saw in newspapers, but by talking to all the beer entrepreneurs and microbrewery enthusiasts, I also came to appreciate something else was going on there. In newspapers, people were just looking for information, but in beer, it wasn't just the product itself. There was something more that they were reading more meaning in. And I would have beer entrepreneurs tell me, that you could drink 6 IPAs and it wasn't like drinking 6 Budweisers. You wouldn't go wrap your car around a pole. So you only need 3 to do that. But so they had this sense that they were transforming communities and cultures, and to some extent that was true, without a doubt. But it was definitely exaggerated, and also, so this is pretty much forgotten now. But the big brewers like Anheuser-Busch, at first they just ignored the microbrewers because they thought, well, this is a trivial part of the market. These people are having fun. Who cares? They're drinking beer. That's what we care about. And then as it kept growing, and especially growing among the high status consumers, Anheuser-Busch started feeling like they needed to be a piece of this and get left out. So they created a brewing lab, essentially. I think it was in Fairfield, California, that was supposed to, develop microbrewed beers, old styles and things, like ales and Hefeweizen and things like this. And, say what you will about Anheuser-Busch and the big brewing companies, like they have enormous resources. They have tremendously talented people, and they can do anything they want in this space, And so when they set out to make good microbrewed beers, they did a great job. And so I remember reading a review of, I forget what the name of it was, but Anheuser-Busch made a Hefeweizen that was really spectacular. And it even got great reviews in all the microbrewery journals and magazines. People said this is really good. But the consumers didn't want to have anything to do with it. I said no. So and that was true for Blue Moon, which was Coors's initial foray into the microbrewery segment. And the same thing. I mean, there was a market for Blue Moon for sure, but it wasn't the hardcore enthusiasts who were really into the microbreweries. And it was because, of this symbolic thing. And so, I thought a lot about that. It's like, what is it that they're really searching for? And authenticity kept coming up. It's like they wanted something that to them reflected an authentic version of beer that was like what people drank in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries and was made according to those authentic methods. It didn't matter if it was even inferior quality. And believe me, a lot of the early microbrewed beers were not very good. They were just ales made in somebody's garage or something. And so that was the thing they were searching for, and they wanted that story associated with it. And so I thought, well, this is pretty fascinating because it's not the actual characteristics, what we call hedonic characteristics of the beer itself, but it's something about the identity of the producer and the authenticity of the producer and the symbolism of that. And so that got, as I started thinking about that, then I thought, well, this is actually something that's broader than just beer. You see this in things like cosmetics, perfumes, all kinds of food products, restaurants, all over the place. And so I started thinking more broadly about authenticity in consumer markets. And, I've come to believe that, an awful lot of contemporary consumption is actually driven by these attempts to find producers of a particular identity that people think is authentic, rather than the characteristics of the product or service itself. So it's what we read into the product and service rather than the actual product or service. This is why blind taste testings and all of this often fail miserably, because it's not really about those characteristics. It's about what I tell you is in this thing and what it means.
What's perceived to be, as opposed to what
absolutely. Now, why people want to consume that, why they search for that, that's more of a philosophical question. I don't really have an answer to that. People do opine about it. I mean, one common argument is that, we live in a mass society where people have trouble feeling individuated and feeling like they're part of this big mass society. They find some way to identify themselves as individuals that stands out. And this kind of consumption is an enactment of that. That may very well be, but I don't know how to prove that. It's just speculative in my view. But it's definitely an increasing trend.
Well, it's really interesting to hear you talk about this, because it actually, Garrett and I had a recent interview with a professor. Her name's Noelle Phillips. She's a professor at a college in British Columbia, and she wrote a couple books on craft beer being in this realm of this literary theory of medievalism, which is basically the same thing. Like we really, in the 21st century, it's sort of a rebellion against these hyper technological developments that we're having. So we all kind of want to take a step back and go back to this perceived time of kind of the Middle Ages, where everything blossomed, and it's kind of the creation and the inception of Western culture as we kind of foresee it. Like she used as, for example, Disney culture. So many Disney themes and settings go back to the Middle Ages. It doesn't even really have to be real, like the concept of Frozen, the movie, if you're familiar with it, or like Shrek, for example. But craft beer is kind of the same thing. We want to go back to when beer was real, when it really started, and having this concept of the 20th century beer is not real. It's macro produced, it's artificial, it's fake. We want to go back to our roots and really have this real entity. So I think that's really,
even if the quality is inferior. That's what's fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, I understand her argument. I think that's something a lot of people would say. I don't know how to, I don't know how to prove that definitively compared to some other things. There's also this alternative argument, which is much more cynical, which I also find appealing, which is that, one thing that a lot of people seem to be doing is basically showing off. Okay, so if you can display this quaint esoteric knowledge about the medieval period, about the origins of beer, about subtleties in wine, and you can do that in public in a informal setting, people say, wow, gosh, Andy's really smart. Look at all that stuff he knows. That's just amazing, And so there may be some status enhancement, self-motivation going on here too. That is a reason why people do this. And so they pick products that, that resonate, that people are familiar with, but they don't know a lot about. And then they want to show you they know a lot more about it than you do, including the stuff that you're consuming.
Is that the foundation of everything that we do? We're just communicating in some way. Do we really even care that much about, oh, this is a very hazy, tropical, fruity IPA? Or is it really going back? I often wonder about that, Glenn, of like, am I really just creating my identity through liking craft beer and being able to sort of put myself on a social status and knowing something, or being part of this community, which is kind of alternative and kind of cool and a little bit exclusive? Is it all just a form of communication? Is that really the basis? Or is it a little bit more sophisticated than that?
Like I said, I can't pin down which of these is the right answer. And I'm not sure there's one, I mean, I can think of some people who are wine snobs because they like to show off, but I know some people who, it's like they can be in their own living room drinking their wine alone and be fully contented with the experience that they're having, because it's about the enjoyment of the beverage itself. So it's, I think it may be a combination, depends on the person. But that's something, again, I put that more in the category of philosophy or social theory rather than, testable social science.
Might be a little, I like your answer to that, Glenn, might be a little bit of each. I feel like maybe in my own personal experience, there are certain things where it's a little bit of each, it's like my own personal preference, but it's also nice to, be part of this crowd. And maybe a portion of that comes down to marketing from, the product owners. But yeah, craft beer has definitely had a number of stereotypes attached to it, for sure.
Glenn, do you have any other predictions, maybe in terms of you foresaw something coming back in the 1980s, and now we're kind of in this weird area of exactly what you said? We have this sort of giants like Coors or Anheuser-Busch that just sort of take up, I think in the US, maybe something like 95% of the market share, and then the rest is sprinkled around the 8,000 other microbreweries. Is that something that is sustainable, that model? Will we see that the market doesn't necessarily have to be with craft beer, but that trend you did sort of lay out with the newspaper industry and craft beer? Is that sustainable? Will that continue in 2050? Are we still going to have just a lot of craft breweries, maybe a little bit more, and Anheuser-Busch will still be at that 95%?
Well, I'll say two things about that. So in a lot of these markets, it seems like there's some cyclicality going on. So once you get the specialist segment, then some of those specialists actually become pretty big and they start adding products. Or what's happened in beer is, the big brewers have bought them and then, kept them. They first internalized them, but then they kept them at arm's length so they could have a separate identity and brand. And so, but some of them have gotten so big that people no longer think they're as authentic as they were either. There are also other industries where it's going on. So the most familiar one to me at the moment is this distilled spirits. And in fact, there's a personal story to this. So when I was at Berkeley working on the beer brewing industry, I had a student who was working for me on something totally different, on a computer simulation model. And he was a guy from engineering, and then he wound up getting an MBA, and he went and had a very successful career in finance and made a fair amount of money and retired, I don't know, at age 40. And then finally, he, like 20 years later, or maybe 15 years later, he calls me and he says, I quit my job and I'm looking for something else to do. He goes, I was thinking about those studies you were doing of beer. He says, yeah, I still have to where to look at that. So I see the plots. And so he went and he looked. He said, you know what? He says, the same thing is going on right now in distilled spirits. This would have been maybe 10 years ago. And he said, I'm going to open up a distillery. I said, really? and he did. Copper Sea, it's called. It's in Hudson Valley, New York. And it was one of the early, not early, it was, it was a reasonably early micro distillery. And they made a rye and then some other products now. They've been fairly successful. But, he got me interested in this. And so I started looking at it, and, it is a fairly similar story in that, you have these big producers, Diageo among them. And, even though like the single malt Scotch whiskeys all talk about the distillery, like Lagavulin or Glenfiddich or whatever, they're all owned by a couple of big companies, a couple of big conglomerates. And so they kind of hide that identity, but now people have started to figure that out. And so the Americans were at the forefront of this, of starting all these new distilleries. And so there's literally, there's hundreds, if not thousands of them around now as well. It's a little different than beer because, to make really good stuff, you have to age it. And so it takes a longer period and a bigger capital investment. But like with Copper Sea, what they did was, they went back and looked like the early recipes these guys made, essentially green liquor, which is unaged. And then they touted that as an authentic product, which it was, and that sustains them through the first few years. I mean, it's even so that I'm blanking on the name. What's the bourbon that's so highly regarded? You guys may know this.
Oh, a few.
Where in
the one that started
Buffalo Trace? Is it?
No. It's no, it sells for thousands of dollars a bottle.
Oh. Good question. Not huge on bourbon.
No.
Anyway, I'll think about it in a bit. So sorry.
Like the original bourbon.
No, it wasn't the original. His father was an original producer, but he's the one who started the micro distillery industry.
Okay.
And I'll come up with it in Italian in a minute. Anyway, let's move on.
No, that's okay. We can look too.
Yeah, I'm curious now. I like a good bourbon. A lot of them are coming up. Like Mitchers. No,
this is the most expensive stuff on the market.
Yeah, Buffalo Trace comes up.
Yeah.
Four Roses, but this might not be as.
No, it's not Four Roses.
Well, it's funny, that whole culture too, Glenn. I'm thinking about authenticity with everything now, because like the whiskey culture really jumps on that concept, doesn't it? Because you can't even call it a bourbon unless it's from the state of Kentucky. Is that right? Like, and I think
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't create a Scotch in North America because that has to be done in Scotland. So yeah, that whole industry is just sort of just seeping of authenticity. And
in general has to be aged 3 years.
Yeah.
There's all.
So what I'm thinking of is Rip Van Winkle.
Okay.
Check that out.
In the Van Winkle. So there's actually a book written about this by a guy who is a sports writer at ESPN who followed this guy around for a year. He's the founder of it. Anyway, it winds up Pappy Van Winkle. Is the name of the
brand.
There's
a couple of those.
And so it winds up he was a contract distiller for a long time. And he didn't even really particularly like his bourbon. Now I think they're all, but that's kind of interesting. That's the other part of the microbrewery story that's often not remembered, is that in the early days, a lot of the first microbrewers didn't even make their own beer. There was a lot of excess capacity in the industry and they were contracted out. So like Pete's Wicked Ale, he never made his own beer. And even Sam Adams, Boston Beer Company, they made very little of their beer originally. Very, very little. They had kind of showcase brewery in downtown Boston, but most of it was made by third-party contractors because there was excess capacity in the industry. And then as the movement picked up and you had all these people with this intense interest in the origins of the beer, people discovered that he wasn't making his own beer, and that really started to hurt him. And Jim Koch, who was the founder of Boston Beer Company, he's famous for saying, well, I don't know why that matters. It's my recipe and I tend to it. So it's like, it's my beer. He goes, if Julia Chow had came over to your house and cooked a dinner, it would be Julia. It doesn't matter whose kitchen it's in. It matters who cooked the dinner. They can do the same thing. He tried that argument, but eventually he gave in and bought the old Hoodapill Shilling Brewery in Cincinnati, Ohio, and has since added on to that. So you had to make your own beer to be authentic and legitimate, and the contract brewers could hide that fact for a while, but in the long run, people found out and quit buying their products as a result of that.
I feel like that's been an underlying narrative of craft beers, maybe even on Southern Ontario as well. Just that, maybe the craft beer purists will turn their nose up at a brewery that just does contract brewing, and they don't have their own spot, they don't have their own tap room. Maybe that even comes back to what the argument of authenticity. It's like,
it's not authentic.
For sure it does. For sure it does. And so that's going on now big time in the micro distillery industry. So, there are all these manufacturing facilities that'll make you a distilled spirit. And again, they'll make it according to your recipe, or they'll help you invent a recipe. And then the companies that are selling, they're just marketing companies. I mean, it's their label and their stuff. But they're in the process of being discovered too. And I think most of them won't survive as a result of that unless they start figuring out how to do it themselves and invest in the capital plan. That's why, I think that's why in the early brew pubs, when you go in, they had the tanks behind the bar, in glass, right, so you could see they're actually making it. A lot of these micro distilleries do that too. They'll take you on a tour, or they have a tasting room with the tank in there and the distilling equipment. So they want to show you all that. I think basically to demonstrate that they are the real thing, that they're producing it in an authentic way.
Yeah, makes sense. You see it a lot now, especially with the microbreweries. If you can display it, it's definitely there for you to see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, how much does government regulation come into play? Is it like, I'm thinking of the examples we've used, because I know I don't really know as much, but I think that it's a little bit more tricky, particularly in Canada, and I suspect in many states as well, to open a distillery, just because you're dealing with harder concentrations of alcohol.
That was true for the microbrewers too. So the origins of that go back to, at least in the United States, to the Prohibition. So part of the rationale for Prohibition in the first place was that the local taverns or pubs had become dens of vice, people thought. So it wasn't just the drinking, it was all the other stuff going on in there. And it was widely believed that all that other stuff was being subsidized by the alcohol producers, the beer companies and like. And so they closed all that down to get rid of all that. And then, then when they eventually decided that was a bad idea, they would bring back alcohol. They wanted to bring it back, but to do something that would exclude the vice. And so in the United States, what was very common was what you had 3-tier laws, which meant that you had to have legal organizational separation of the producer of the beer, the distributor of the beer, and the retailer of the beer. And those laws were in effect until the beginning of the microbrewery movement in the 1980s. And in fact, they all had to be changed for the microbreweries to operate. And so what happens in California, Oregon, and Washington were 3 of the earliest states to change these laws. And, they went to the legislature and they made an argument that, we can create this new industry if you'll change these laws. The laws were changed, but only for breweries below a specific size level or output level. And so this is why Anheuser-Busch doesn't have a whole set of brew pubs around, like a McDonald's outlets. I mean, they could have done that otherwise, but you had to be below a certain size. So if you were small, you could do that. And then the same is true for distilled spirits. In fact, I think in many states that probably still is true. And I've been to a number of distilleries where you cannot taste the product on premises because of these laws. So they're not even allowed to give you a sample. Now, again, all this is changing, but in the US, it has to change state by state. In Canada, I think it has to change province by province. But these were big obstacles in some states. In the US for beer, I know Michigan was a very, very late state in allowing these kinds of operations. And that was because it became very political. The distributors, who had a lot to lose in this game, started lobbying heavily to keep the existing laws, which basically secured their economic place.
It's really interesting you mentioned that concept of like Anheuser-Busch creating little McDonald's across the United States, and how that just really isn't possible because of rules and legislation. It's funny because I was in the United Kingdom in the summertime, and they kind of have that with a company called Brewdog. There's just Brewdog's this big Scottish brewery, and then and you go around London and you see like Brewdog pubs popping up, and it's almost like, from my cultural lens of that, it's kind of almost like it's extracting the craft beer culture from America and putting it on display in the McDonald's format, which I thought was really kind of odd. And I might be wrong about that. Yeah, but
that's kind of true. Although in Britain, they had a microbrewery revolution before we did. So going back in the 70s, maybe even before that, there was something called CAMRA, was the acronym, CAMRA. It was a campaign for real ale. And that basically started, I think, worldwide, probably the microbrewers in operation. And that was pretty successful. I haven't seen these brew dogs, but I mean, it's these laws are incredibly complicated, and they change all the time. So it's almost, unless you're an attorney, or you're in the industry, it's hard to keep up with them. But that I think might not have been, what you're describing might not have been possible some years ago, but clearly is now. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a threat, because those guys can always, they're not going to make the same product. It's not going to be appealing to the enthusiast because the identity is different, but they will be able to sell things at a much lower price, I suspect, and offer all kinds of other things that is hard for a local brewery to offer. Yeah. So I think it's still a tough business, possibly.
Well, Glenn, it's coming up on the hour mark. I think we have a few more minutes left with you. I wanted you're so knowledgeable on the industry, on the history of beer, particularly focused in the United States, which of course is sort of perhaps the birthplace of the modern craft beer movement. I think that's suffice to say. Is there any interest in more academic pieces coming from you that focus on this topic? Like I said, you've written some articles, but anything maybe that I know you're focused more now recently on distilleries, so making a bit more of being a bit more making the predictions that you seem to be very good at. But is there any interest in getting back and focusing on this particular industry again, or you're busy with other things?
Probably not. I mean, it's kind of like, I feel like I've been there and done that, and it'd be hard to match my early predictions. So better off leaving it alone. I do drink beer still occasionally, and I do appreciate a good beer, and so that's great. But I don't think I'll probably study beer again. I mean, I am still interested in authenticity, and there's a lot of interesting questions still out there, including, I mean, one of the criticisms that's sometimes made about my story about authentic consumption is that many of the products tend to be fairly high-end consumables that are expensive and appreciated most by affluent audiences. So the question is this just a fashion among rich people, or is it something more broadly? And so I don't think it's just rich people, but I think that's certainly worth exploring. And so we're looking into that. So I think there are markets like for, let's say, guns or swords that are really sophisticated markets. When you look at the enthusiasts, they really care about old guns and workmanship, and swords of particular types of steel and the like. And there is a question about the authenticity of those things that's also pretty much of interest. Now, I think that's a very different social group that's interested in guns and swords and is interested in wine, and distilled spirits might have some overlap. I don't know, but certainly than wine. So it's not, I don't know it's as educated or as affluent income wise, but they certainly have this similar intense experience in it. The other thing, so I didn't mention this earlier, but I will. So when I was studying the microbreweries, I also had a chance to spend 6 months in Hong Kong, and they had some microbreweries there. There's one South China Brewing Company, and they were on Hong Kong Island, and they made a very good set of products. And I went over and talked to them, and and I was asking them about their markets, and they said, well, in Hong Kong, our beers appeal very much to expatriates, especially Americans and the Brits and the Western Europeans. And our pitch to them is exactly the same as it would be in the United States. It's an authentic ale brewed by traditional methods using all natural ingredients. However, when it comes to the Chinese consumers, they don't want to have anything to do with that old-fashioned craft stuff. They want stuff made in a modern, high technology brewery. And so we have a totally different marketing angle that we give to them. So that got me thinking about, what is it about this taste for authenticity that might vary across cultures and societies? And, is it just the product, or is it a real cultural difference? And so I set out to try and find a comparable set of products to beer and, craft brewing in China and Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan, like Asian countries, and came to convince myself that there is such a product as namely tea, especially green tea. And so you could go to these tea houses in downtown Tokyo or Singapore, and they have all these esoteric teas, and the guy will climb a ladder and get it for you, and he tells you how it's from this mountain picked in this year, and it's only under certain conditions can they do it. And then they'll make you a pot of that tea, and you see these guys coming in these fancy suits and drinking it, going, and consuming. It's just like, and I'm sure they could not identify that tea in a blind taste test, but it's the same kind of consumption of this symbolic consumption about something that's old-fashioned and authentic, and is really it resonates with their culture more than beer does, and so I think these things are everywhere. It's just fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny you say that. I lived in China for a short period of time, and there really is with this whole theme of authenticity. It's very interesting when you look at a country like China, because you have such a deep, immense history in this country, and you have such cultural identities and subcultures existing everywhere, but you have the narrative from the government saying, no, we're pushing forward into modernity, we're leaving things behind. I remember seeing a lot of times there's just pop-up little street markets all over the place, and they have to be ready to shut down and run away because the police come around and say, no, we're not doing this anymore. We're not having street markets anymore. They're dirty. They're not up to safety regulations. But it's so ingrained in their culture that they're still very popular because people want these street markets. But the government narrative is, no, we don't want the sense of of authenticity. We want new. New is better.
So and traditional Chinese medicine, I think, is the same kind of thing. I mean, it's you'll get people who will say, well, it really is effective. I don't necessarily believe that, but it's like, but it persists for these same kinds of reasons. I mean, the government does have options to modernize, like the food in the night market. So I don't know if you've been to Singapore, but Singapore, basically they preserved all of this in the stalls, and it's really pretty interesting because you can still get that kind of food experience and yet be comfortable in knowing it's fairly hygienic because it's controlled.
Yeah, Singapore is really good with that. You have the street food culture, but you're kind of also surrounded by massive new skyscrapers that make you still feel like you're in Manhattan or Hong Kong or San Francisco, maybe. Yeah. Well, Glenn, we thank you so much for your time. It's pretty much on that hour mark, so we want to be respectful of your time, of course. But Glenn Carroll, professor of management and sociology at Stanford University. Glenn, we hope maybe have you on again sometime, because I feel like we barely scratched the surface on your expertise and what the knowledge you have to share. So we really appreciate your time, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Garrett. I mean, it's been fun talking to you, and if you do ever want me to come back, I'd be happy to do that. So it'd be fun. So maybe I'll have something new to talk about then too. So anyway, I will start listening to your podcast now. I think I haven't heard too many of them, but I can tell they're going to be interesting. So I'm going to go back and look at your own catalog now.
You can start with listening to yours.
No, that's going to bore me to death.
Right. Well, we'll let you know if we're ever in the Bay Area. We'd love to have a beer.
Okay.
For sure.
Yeah. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Glenn. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.